Welcome again to day 7 of the hearing for the VMFRP East project. As you can see, we have member Bates online today, and member Elliott and I will be here as well, so in person. So in terms of just a few preliminary matters from the committee side of things that we wanted to run through first, and just the first one is in relation to Dr. Pardo and Ms. Peace. So just recapping what's happened so far. So on the 30th of June, which was the last time we sat, the committee made a couple of comments in relation to Dr. Pardo's appearance and sort of a timeline of events. Just to reiterate those comments, steps that have happened so far is Ms. Peace indicated that she was unable to attend on the day and requested the committee call her witness. In response to that, the proponent raised some oral concerns about the potential procedural issues. After that, the committee wrote to Ms. Peace indicating a proposed course of action. Ms. Peace didn't raise any concerns about that course of action, and the proponent wrote again, I think it was just before the hearing on that day, raising further concerns, and Ms. Peace confirmed again that she was satisfied, and the committee was also satisfied that enough steps had been taken to make her aware of the process. Since that time, the PPV project team has received some correspondence, including some text messages and emails from Ms. Peace. In response to that, the committee has directed Ms. Peace to send communications to the VMFRP email, so the email address that's in the directions, and advised Ms. Peace that we're unable to consider documents or submissions of sort of communications in general that are not made in accordance with the committee's directions. We understand since that time, Ms. Peace has also contacted the proponent with some questions. We've just forwarded a copy of some other correspondence to the proponent, and we might, if we need to take a break after submissions to run through any response to that. But we've also, Ms. Peace has indicated, so we've received her written submissions, but she's indicated that she's not well enough to make a submission today. So the committee will read her submissions in detail, and we've also offered Ms. Peace an opportunity to have an alternative time slot on tomorrow or Thursday morning before the proponent makes its closing submissions. We understand that Ms. Peace declined that offer, and that we were going to proceed to read her submissions and consider them on the basis of the written material. I don't know whether Ms. Peace is online at the moment.
Yes, she is.
Oh, Ms. Peace, just checking if you had anything to say about that, or you understood that we were going to review your submissions in writing.
Good morning, members of the panel. I wasn't aware of that, but thank you for that.
Okay, I think that email might have just been sent recently.
Thank you.
And are you happy to proceed on the basis that we'll read the material that you filed, and the proponent will also read that and respond to anything that arises in their closing submission?
Oh yes, I'm very happy about that. Thank you.
Okay, and just confirming you don't want another time to appear?
No, I'm still not well enough to appear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Peace. Okay, and just off the back of that process, we've also sent some correspondence to all parties on the not the distribution list, all parties, just reminding them that all correspondence needs to be sent to the people on the distribution list, which includes the proponent. Does the proponent have anything to say in relation to that?
No, thank you.
Okay, all right. Okay, so on the same theme, we're just following on the 1st of July, Dr. Pardo tabled a summary, it's called a presentation document. Originally, we didn't table that document because we thought it could potentially have new information in it. We've since read the document. It doesn't have any new information. We've tabled it. It's been given a document number, so now that's tabled. We're satisfied that it's not new material. It's just a summary of some material that was in his written statement that was filed in accordance with the directions. And just, you already have the document list, but the main submissions that we've received over the last couple of days is the submission from Ms. Peace, which we've referred to. We've also received material from the Friends of the Koala group as well. So they've all been tabled and all parties should be able to access them. I think that's all from the committee side of things. Was there anything from the proponent?
No, I don't think so. I've just been the Part B, but...
Oh, we did get the Part B as well. Yes, sorry. I should have said that other. Yeah. Okay. All right. On that basis, was there any... Okay. Any other parties have any other questions before we move into the proponent's Part B submission? Okay. All right. So we're a little bit ahead of schedule already, but we're happy to... We have read the submission, not in complete detail, but we have read through it. So
All right.
over to you. Yeah.
We'll try and do it in a way that we don't read it, but it's kind of just an exercise of working through it.
Yes,
I
that's
anticipated that the committee might have an opportunity to glance at it, but not, as you say, in the full detail. So if there's anything that arises that we can assist along the way, we invite the committee to perhaps jump in along
Yes.
the way, or make your election at the end or at the start or whenever you like to.
Yeah, we just had a discussion about that before. If there's something pops up in the middle, we'll raise it. But given we've got member Bates online, if there's anything we need to talk about as a group, we might have a break towards the end and just. Thank you.
Right, so the front page there just summarises what this document's doing. It's responding to Direction 40 and goes through the proponent's position on in respect of key issues, in response to submissions and evidence, and our position on the project documentation. And it's set out in the 3 parts. And if we can start with some opening observations, and that this is a document drafted at this stage of the hearing. There's more to come, but at this stage, our submission is that there's been very little controversy relative to other hearings that this division of the committee panel, I'm sure, would have been in. We've called witness after witness. Witness after witness has not been challenged. There's been 2 submitters who have been heard and have not expressed opposition to the projects or queried the methodology or the conclusions of the environment report. And the evidence of our witnesses, as we submitted just before, has largely been, and in many cases wholly been, unchallenged through any material or relevant cross-examination. And we submit that's significant in the context of a forum where you have allowed expert evidence. You don't have to allow witnesses or expert evidence. You don't have to allow cross-examination or re-examination, but in this forum that has been permitted. And in that context, we have submitters, of course, and you'll give submissions the weight that you would like to attribute to the respective submissions. But when it comes to expert evidence, that's in a different category. And our submission to you is that when you have a witness come before you with the qualifications that they have, unless there's a good reason for you not to accept the entirety of the evidence that the witnesses have put before in front of you, we invite the committee to entirely accept the evidence and allocate to it even more weight than the submissions. The reason for that is because the experts are kind of foreign to this process. They're not submitters. They're in a separate category. And the cross-examination process and re-examination process enables those people to be tested, scrutinised by anyone who might want to challenge something they're saying. Now, for those witnesses that weren't challenged, we'd submit that it's a relatively easy conclusion for the committee just to accept entirely what they've said as unchallenged expert evidence. For those that received some questions, we'd submit that universally each of the witnesses that were asked questions responded very well to each of the questions in a way that was informed, measured, and in the nature of our expert response. They weren't seeking to argue a case or take a particular advocacy position. They were staying within their lane, if I was to adopt a colloquialism, in that they stayed within their area of expertise and answered the question. And so for that category of the witnesses that you've had, with the limited amount of cross-examination, we'd submit to you that join with those witnesses that didn't have cross-examination, there'd be no basis for the committee not to accept the entirety of what the evidences, expert witnesses have said to you. And so we then go on and we acknowledge the constructive approach that the committee has adopted as appropriately been inquisitorial along the way, enabling witnesses to explain their evidence to you directly, and also by raising questions along the way. Sometimes we were able to give an answer straight away, at other times it was on notice, and sometimes we responded orally or with a document. We footnoted a document as an example. And then for the purpose of this submission, we've sought to identify relevant conclusions and recommendations of the committee in respect to the central packages, and recommendations of the Minister in respect of those packages as relevant to the issues arising in this proposal. We do acknowledge that they're different though. There's significant detail and a wide range of matters that was considered by the committee reports and the Minister's assessments, and we don't seek to comprehensively record all the relevant conclusions and recommendations or all the matters considered by the committee or the Minister in those other packages, but we trust that where we have done it, that you might find it of assistance when you come to deliberate in this matter. And then we have the Part C to come, and we'll respond as appropriate to matters that arise in the next couple of days, and also the preferred final version of the documentation for the project. Then in terms of the key issues, we set out there the key issues, and paragraph 9, acknowledging the site-specific nature of most ecological values of the floodplains, like the central projects, the floodplains here are identified as warranting inclusion in the VMFRP because of their trajectory of decline and because their ecological requirements cannot be met by inundation through implementation of the basin plan measures alone. Existing conditions are well known, having been examined through the application of appropriate methodology, standards and guidelines over many years, many thousands of person hours. As projects proposed for environmental and other benefits, they have been designed with a focus on achieving improvements to biodiversity, cultural heritage and socio-economic benefits while minimising impacts so far as reasonably practicable. Existing conditions are examined and potential impacts and potential benefits are assessed using robust, well-reasoned methodologies consistent with applicable standards and practices. And so with that in mind, we have been seeking to support the committee in identifying where this committee has previously reached particular conclusions in respect to the methodology, approach and principle, and we'll invite you to reach similar conclusions in respect to this project. The policy and the research supporting the VMFRP continues to develop, and that's to be understood as projects emerge and at the implementation stage there'll be learnings, and it reinforces the need for the projects to avoid continuing ecological decline, even assuming other measures to improve environmental conditions in the Murray-Darling Basin are implemented, and the likelihood that this need will become more pressing in the likely climate change future. One of the queries I think that you raised, Member McMillan, was in relation to SIDLAM, and it's in this context we can confirm that the projects remain important state and federal commitments, notwithstanding they won't be accounted for in the 26 reconciliation of the SIDLAM carried out by the Basin Authority, having now been withdrawn as supply measures by the Basin Operating Committee. I think there's something that materials that came through this morning think been described as a media release, which
Yeah.
hasn't been supplied, but we're assuming it's that footnote 7 is the reference to it. But nothing arises from that. As was said in paragraph 12, the projects.
Let me just check that. What was the date of that media article? That
was
sorry, I can just
1st of July.
Yes, I think that's the one that had been raised to our attention, should we say? Yeah.
So nothing arises out of that. Remain important state and federal commitments. And I think it was suggested that the project has been withdrawn. That's not the case. And then the potential benefits and impacts of the project structured by reference to the class of uncertainties that the Minister identified as requiring examination and assessment of the reasons for his decisions under the environmental effect, also setting out that section. So then we go into the topics, surface water and groundwater, and conscious of, I'm in part just reading this, but I'll try and skip it a little bit quicker. Surface water, you heard from the witnesses, Mr. Tate and Dr. Treadwell, on the modelling and the surface water. The environment report demonstrates that the projects will effectively enable the inundation of the targeted areas of the floodplains to better align with the ecological requirements and can be designed, constructed and operate to enable achievement of the full range of intended benefits without any significant residual effects. So then in terms of the modelling, we've set out there at 17 that the modelling was done in a way that's consistent with the EAST packages and appropriate for the assessment of potential benefits. The hydraulic modelling for the EAST was prepared by DHI, informs assessment of the floodplain inundation extent and depth and the hydraulics, and enables understanding of the extent and nature of inundation associated with the infrastructure, addressing hydraulics of the floodplain, the connectivity with the river and other waterways in both pre-project and post-project conditions, and water quality associated with natural, that is unregulated high flow events, and project facilitated inundation. The objectives of the modelling are listed there at 19, and the committee would be familiar with those by this stage of the hearing. And then at 20, the modelling enables assessment of a range of matters that are set out there at paragraph 20. There's some difference maps identified there at 21 that are provided for key hydraulic parameters, depth, velocity, shear stress for each scenario, allowing the locations and magnitudes of changes to be identified. And it's prepared on the basis of specific consideration of the conclusions of the central committees, the Minister's assessment, and the NIA and VMFRP projects in respect of the modelling required to support analysis of the full range of potential environmental effects associated with these projects. Mr. Tate gave evidence in respect to the modelling, and you heard what he said, that it was an iterative peer review. Along the way, he was going back and forward with more peer inputs, looking for more answers and some questions that he raised along the way, and then ultimately concluded that the modelling methodology was appropriate, the input data appropriate, represented the best available information, the quality modelling, water quality modelling was appropriately calibrated, and it was appropriate basis to test performance of the proposed future works and other scenarios, and the modelling does not suggest any adverse effects, subject to confirmation in operation that the modelled potential for overtopping of existing perimeter levees at Gunbower will not be realised. And then Mr. Tate's evidence is consistent with the conclusion of DECA, and DECA's conclusion was that the modelling supporting the EAST represents a material improvement on the modelling relied upon for the earlier assessments and provides increased confidence in predicted outcomes. And Mr. Tate's evidence was not challenged, and we submit with respect it should be accepted by you. The hydrological modelling, on which the environment reports consideration of flow data for modelling natural baseline and benchmarks, Murray model, consistent with the approach in the central packages, where the committee found it was fit for purpose as an appropriate model to underpin the assessment of effects of the relevant projects. It supports analysis of historical and likely future changes of patterns of river flow and floodplain inundation, and it demonstrates the extent to which the hydrology of the floodplains has been altered by regulation, the need for the projects to enable inundation, given the significant difference between river flows today and into the likely climate future, and those which historically would have inundated the floodplains. Then in terms of the assessment, Dr. Treadwell is expert in freshwater aquatic ecology and ecohydrology, including interpretation of hydrology and hydraulic characteristics and implications for aquatic ecosystem outcomes. He was responsible for the specialist assessment C, and as he explained, that includes consideration of those matters at 29. His evidence was that in existing conditions, the floodplains feature flora and fauna dependent on inundation, but are inundated at frequencies and for durations significantly less than natural pre-regulation conditions, and climate change is likely to mean frequency and duration of inundation is reduced further. In respect to potential construction effects, the project involves risks common with all construction, increased risks associated with construction on a floodplain and in a proximity to water bodies and waterways. Potential adverse effects on surface water values are appropriately avoided, mitigated and managed in accordance with the proposed EDS. And in terms of potential operational effects, the infrastructure has been designed to minimise afflux and ensure that the floodplain, both within and beyond the maximum inundation extents, continue to inundate similar to current conditions on the principle that infrastructure should be invisible to high flow events. Some areas of the floodplain would be inundated at lower flow levels than currently occurs, with such differences reducing flow levels as flow levels increase. In terms of shear stresses and velocities, concluded it's essentially no difference, and there's some provisions in the EDS to deal with those matters. C, the likelihood of low dissolved oxygen events was considered, and nothing of significance arose there. In terms of D, other water quality risks were considered, and going through things like salinity, nutrients, algal plumes, while not necessarily adverse to water quality values. Again, the conclusions are recorded there at D1 through to 5. And at E, residual effects of the projects on surface water values are insignificant to low, and the conclusion was the potential for cumulative effects is low. And Dr. Treadwell responded to relevant submissions made during the exhibition by reference to the relevant assessments and conclusions in each respect. In terms of black water or low DO events, that was relatively recent in the hearing, and the committee, I expect, will recall what Dr. Treadwell's explanations and assessments were on those matters, so I won't read those next sections. And at 33, the assessment of potential effects of low DO events on aquatic ecology was addressed further below, but for present purposes, we note that Dr. Lefevre agreed that the decline in DO concentration in the Murray River as a result of outflows from managed inundation of the project is so low that it's unlikely to be measurable, and confirmed that there's a low likelihood of adverse effects on the Murray River and the aquatic values it supports. And the proposed EDS SW2 specifically requires operation of the projects to specifically consider and seek to avoid and minimise and manage low DO events where practicable, and in effect, it's the witnesses' evidence was that it's largely a natural event anyway. It can be managed, and when it goes back to the river, it's a drop in the ocean.
Or the river.
Probably not the previous expression.
A drop in the river.
So then in terms of surface water values, we invite you to conclude those matters that we've set out at 35. In terms of model overtopping of the levies, the key point here is that whilst at 37 identified that the levies prevented inundation of private land during those large events in 22-23, which exceeded the maximum inundation extent in its depth and extent. So the risk of actual perimeter levy overtopping during the project operation is remote and unlikely to be realised. In any event, the EDS provides an assurance that private land would not be inundated by the operation of the project other than by landholder agreement. You might recall we had an exchange, we pointed to the particular one. It's hard immediately to conceive of a situation where a farmer, landowner is going to agree to being inundated, but it might suit them. But if it does, there'd be an agreement before that was to occur, otherwise it just won't occur. And then we invite you to accept Dr. Treadwell's evidence, which was unchallenged. Groundwater then, you heard then from Mr. Hoxley, the author of Specialist Assessment D. He explained that groundwater is well understood in and around the project areas. There was a submission that you recall he responded to. The submission was to the effect that it wasn't well understood, but you recall Mr. Hoxley said, well, there's actually a lot of information, a lot of historical data, and so he's well understood. There's also monitoring bores that have been installed and maintained by the CMA that has also added to the historical data pool, and that rise and fall of groundwater is well known and understood, and that what's proposed here in terms of groundwater levels and quality is fundamentally consistent with natural processes, so that when the water comes, the water table goes up, when the water goes away, it goes down. And even with my lay understanding of groundwater, that seems to make a lot of sense, but along the way provides benefits to vegetation, which accesses groundwater with increased evapotranspiration associated with higher level groundwater levels. And he also considered salinity and said that it was insignificant in terms of any effects on any relevant values. There was a question there from you, Member Bates, and Mr. Hoxley identified that it's really difficult to see how salinity could increase above that modelled, and he gave specific evidence in respect of the adequacy of monitoring using existing bores, and that there's no need or justification for additional bores. He supported the exhibited EDS and monitoring requirements in that respect, noting the proposal that monitoring be reviewed on an ongoing basis through operation. And again, he's in the category of witnesses where his evidence was not challenged, and with respect, we invite you to accept his evidence in its entirety. Then turning to...
Just ask a question. It might actually, you might get to it in a moment, but just that monitoring question, I can't remember exactly which witness said it, but something about EPA had recommended some additional monitoring in, I think it was about groundwater. And is my recollection correct that he said it wouldn't be necessary, but that the proponent had included it in the updated EDS anyway? Is that? I can't remember who said it.
Treadwell's said that he was a bit like lemon tea on it. He initially said it wasn't necessary because it was picked up elsewhere
Yes.
in the EDS, but didn't mind that it was there really as a boilerplate. Mr. Forrester can show it to you and explain it.
Thanks.
Thanks. I take it, Member Millen, you're referring to GS1 and GS2
Yeah,
and those
that's
additions, which
Yeah.
Dr. Treadwell addressed. I think otherwise Mr. Hoxley addressed in general terms the adequacy of monitoring.
Yes.
It doesn't propose any changes in that respect.
Yes.
So the
Okay.
GS1 and GS2 in the day one EDSs reflect, if you like, the EPA position, noting Dr. Treadwell's position as Mr. O'Farrell's described.
Okay. Thank you.
So it's one of those ones that I think our client's position probably is it's not necessary to have it because it's already covered, but it doesn't really matter too much if it's in there because they're going to be doing it anyway. In the materials, the day one we put forward, we've adopted the EPA's recommendation in any event. So we're a little bit apart from Dr. Treadwell's evidence, but he wasn't going to stay in the trench on that one.
Okay. No problem. Thank you.
So then moving to the project documentation, the next section of the submission, what we do there is go through the provisions and trying to identify those that are consistent with the previous packages and those areas where there's been some refinements. And so we could go through those in more detail if you wanted us to, but hopefully the footnotes, when you come to deliberate, you might find of assistance. But for example, if I look at page 15, Roman 5, EDS SW2, requirements in respect of operation within the environmental water management cycle, with operating plans to be developed to outline operational arrangements, including overarching risk and, in fact, I picked a good example.
Jump down to A.
Yeah,
It's the right EDS.
Right EDS, but the wrong paragraph. Paragraph 49 might be a better example. 49.2, the EES Central Committee recommended amendments to EDS SW2 to include text which identified each of the measures to be considered as appropriate as being related to one of the specific potential effects listed in the EDS. For example, by adding the underlined words, provide through flow to replicate first flush or consider staged inundation to minimise the risk of anoxic black water events. I think that's an example of where in this EDS that additional text has been picked up. And then after C, you can see that the Central Committee recommended similar, different changes to EDS SW2 in the context of NIA and VMFRP, and in respect of this EMF, the ER does not adopt the Central Committee's recommendation that each matter to be considered be specifically linked to specific potential effects or to be avoided, minimised and managed, because it's both unnecessary, because the matters to be considered immediately follow the list of potential effects. So I should withdraw, I think, what I said a bit earlier on.
Yeah.
This is how we're putting it. And inconsistent with the fact that a number of the relevant matters to be considered relate to more than one potential effect. For example, providing through flow may also be considered in the context of algal growth or native fish movement. It includes requirements for monitoring and reporting of native fish strandings, but in monitoring requirement MAE2 rather than EDS SW2, and omits the central specific reference. In the context of potential salinity effects, to identify central at EDS Central and to a lesser extent ER Central, and having regard to the comparatively fewer existing bores in the relevant project areas than the network available in these project sites, the Central Committee recommended specific reference to in EDS GW2 to the groundwater monitoring network, including wells or bores, by reference to locations expected to be the most sensitive to groundwater rise or salinity increase, and for the operation of the projects to be reviewed and modified if a significant trend of increasing salinity is identified. And consistent with this, it recommended changes to those two provisions to refer to new groundwater monitoring sites, as salinity and groundwater quality more broadly has not been identified as a risk for the ER East, and consistent with Mr Hoxley's unequivocal evidence regarding the adequacy of the identified bores for the purposes of monitoring, the changes recommended by the Central Committee for the relevant projects are not included in the environment report here or the monitoring requirements. In the context of specific locations on the relevant floodplains identified as being at particular risk of erosion, and in advance of the further hydraulic analysis recommended by the Central Committee, that committee recommended reference to specific locations in GS1 and 3 and monitoring requirement GSC1. No such risk is identified in the context of the projects having regard to the hydraulic analysis, and therefore we haven't included that there in this EDS. The Central Committee recommended changes to monitoring requirements to include in what was MAE3 specific reference to changes in carp populations. Monitoring in respect of carp has been integrated in the East MAE1. The Central Committee recommended a new monitoring requirement, AE7, to monitor report on native fish strandings, and that's been incorporated into AE2 here. Other recommendations of the central packages in respect of the EDS and monitoring requirements have been responded to in the preparation of this one. The Central Committee's recommended inclusion of a new EDS SW4 and GS1 for 9 vinifera requiring further hydraulic analysis to inform floodplain vegetation assessment and consideration of erosion and sediment through design. The Minister supported each recommendation with some changes to drafting recommended by the committee, and as explained in our opening submission, the analysis required by these EDS has been undertaken as part of the preparation of the project, and accordingly the EMF does not include a similar EDS. The Central Committee recommended inclusion of new EDS SW5 in respect of the design of regulators to ensure flow velocities suitable for fish passage, and the Central Committee made a consistent recommendation in the Environment Report Committee, and that's now reflected in those criteria and EDS provisions here. The Central EDS recommendation also addressed turtle passage arising from a specific consideration in respect of the use of vertical slot fishways at Balsar Yungara, which are not proposed for ER East projects and therefore is not addressed in the ERS EMF. So then that's that first topic, and that first topic was surface water and groundwater. So we now go to topic B, biodiversity, and we set out there what the referral letter identified, and that uncertainties associated with, in fact, I'm sure the committee is familiar with that. 52, the Environment Report examines and assesses the documents improvements to and the potential effects on biodiversity in those areas of the report. And you have evidence from Dr. Lefevre, Ms. Jolly and Mr. Holmes in respect of those matters. Benefits and effects, you have the specialist assessments A and B, the evidence of all three witnesses, but it's unequivocal where it all lands that the projects would achieve benefits to biodiversity, and it's just not surprising at all that that's the conclusion. These benefits would, viewed through the lens of biodiversity alone, substantially outweigh any localised or temporary impacts associated with project construction. We trust that when you went out to the site view, you identified immediately the huge geography of the project area, but then when it was pointed out what's actually proposed to be constructed, the tiny construction footprint relative to it. And although there'll be some areas of construction disturbance during construction, you saw on the ground what projects look like not long after they were constructed. In those small areas under construction supervision, environmental management during the construction program, those projects they bed in very quickly and move forward from there. The assessment of impacts and benefits in the AOBs demonstrates the extent to which floodplain species and communities are expected to benefit and the extent to which this is expected to very substantially outweigh impacts. Consistent with the approach to the examination and assessment of surface water and groundwater, the approach to assessing biodiversity and demonstrating overall improvements is informed by the conclusions of the committee and the minister in respect to the central packages, and we've addressed that in our opening submission and also in DECA's submission on exhibition. Terrestrial flora is then dealt with in the next section. Ms. Jolly's evidence, she went through the background of all the assessment that had taken place, and that led through to 64 there, where in our Part A submission we spoke in more detail about the avoidance and minimisation of impacts, and then at B pointed to the Guthrie and Benwell project as well. Then across the page at 63, we make the point that the impacts on native vegetation that have been assessed have been conservatively assessed, in that they are based on the construction footprint, which would be the subject of further refinement and detailed design, or subject to further avoidance and minimisation requirements. The construction of the footprint includes significant extensive tracts which may ultimately require no work, and they include indirect impacts on vegetation where more than 10% of the TPZ, NRZ, I think you understand that point. You saw a lot of those lengthy roads where the canopies go at the top, and the assessment says they're all going, but the reality is they won't. And we have that document there in respect to the NIA and VMFRP projects. The Central Committee observed that accountability would be provided through the EDS construction biodiversity administrative processes, which requires the sub-plan, including auditable specific commitments for avoiding and minimising impacts on biodiversity values, as well as approval of the encompassing construction EMP by the Secretary. And the Central Committee concluded that, subject to its recommendation that EDS E1 should include more detail on avoidance and minimisation effects, the project will appropriately avoid and minimise impacts on native veg from construction. And the same processes and relevant provisions on project documentations requiring further avoidance and minimisation of impacts are adopted here.
Could I just ask a question about the role of the So obviously we asked some questions earlier about DECA's submission, and we still have to hear from them, that they were indicating that there might be the conservation works exemption apply to the project because of the, net benefit. In that circumstance, what would be the ongoing role of the Secretary of DECA? I'm just sort of the practical side of things. I think some of the EDSs, I think they're the EDSs or the EMF is framed with reference to the role of the Secretary. You don't have to answer this now, but I'm just wondering how that would hook in from a sort of enforcement or practical perspective if the exemption ended up getting granted.
Yeah, I might have a look at it and answer you in a bit more fulsome detail when we come back to the documents later in the day. We might just go through the documents. Immediate thing that comes to mind is the monitoring reports would go to them.
Oh, right, yeah.
But we'll just go through and we might even just highlight in the documents where DECA's roles are.
Yes, okay, no, that's fine.
And you might even point us to the EMF section that possibly does that, to that question, maybe.
Yeah.
Then at 23, we deal with listed species and communities. In summary, at 70, no adverse effects affected for any EPBC listed species. Most FFG Act listed species are unlikely to be impacted, and where impacts may occur, they are minor in consequence and unlikely to be ecologically significant. Ms. Jolly pointed to operations having very significant benefit for almost all listed species and communities. She explained in her evidence the specialist assessment B, paragraph 72, identified that the operation of the Gunbower project would result in a direct negative impact of approximately 4.2 hectares of VPBC listed grey box grassy woodland threatened environmental community, which is now present on the relevant part of the floodplain as a result of terrestrialisation consequent on altered hydrology. This gives rise to a peculiar situation where altered hydrology, an identified threatening process, has terrestrialised this part of the floodplain, and better aligning inundation with natural conditions can be identified as impacting the TEC that terrestrialisation has produced. As Jolly observed in her evidence, this impact is significantly outweighed by the benefits to that community elsewhere in the floodplain. And as DECA observes, the assessment demonstrates that 45 hectares of the same EPBC listed community is modelled to benefit during operation from a restored inundation regime result in a quantified net benefit of approximately 216% when benefits are compared to impacts. So no EPBC Act listed threatened ecological communities are present in Guthrie and Benwell area. So it is, we use the word peculiar, but it's an interesting situation with the terrestrialisation that's occurring, but you can see that it's an overall consideration of what is an ecological response to an altered series of flow regimes, and what this project's seeking to do is kind of undo that and press forward another form of vegetation, perhaps the vegetation that was there originally, into those terrestrialised areas.
Just in terms of the benefit in that little extract, paragraph 74, we're going very strictly to our, question before us is sort of a no project and project option. That percentage there is framed in that way, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so even if the terrestrialisation thing aside.
Yeah, good way to put it.
Yeah, okay.
So then move into terrestrial fauna, and Mr. Holmes' evidence you heard, 78 is an existing trajectory of decline in fauna habitat. It mirrors that described for vegetation for similar reasons. And then in terms of 79 in construction, there's no adverse effects expected for EPBC Act listed species at Gunbower, and where potential effects are identified at Guthrie and Benwell, they are limited to insignificant or minor consequence. And we then address FFG listed species at Gunbower, no impact expected on amphibians, effects unlikely for bush birds and animals, and if such effects did occur, they'd be insignificant and minor. Wetland dependent birds effects are not expected and would be negligible if they did occur. For reptiles, most affected pathways are unlikely, with a loss of small area of habitat and potential for individuals to be killed during construction, giving rise to a medium overall adverse effect. The FFG listed species Gut Benwell, no impacts are expected. For some species and for others, effects are unlikely to occur and would have insignificant or minor consequences, which would not alter overall ecology. Construction will unavoidably remove some fauna habitat, including hollow-bearing trees, reducing a residual adverse effect assessed as medium in the short term. The effect is localised, as Mr. Holmes observed, would be experienced by fauna in the context of a floodplain with many available hollows, and it's outweighed by the benefits delivered across substantially larger, and the potential direct loss of trees, it's in the order of 600 across both sites, against an expectation of improvement to the health of some 17,000 trees. So the maths on that, it's pretty easy for someone to just come to the conclusion that the greater good of a much larger volume of trees as compared to the potential loss of a smaller number of trees, one can see that in the context of benefits for current and future generations, it's really simple to come to the conclusion that the overall net benefit is substantial. Particularly when one adds to it the trajectory, include the climate future that's projected, one can immediately see that, I touched on this earlier, but what we expected, the committee was quite struck when we went to that part of the forest where we saw those stag trees. That experience that we all shared, these projects are about that for our children's, grandchildren's, great-grandchildren, so that in many generations to come, that experience is available. And these wonderful trees that have existed for many hundreds of years continue and are not lost to to this part of the earth. So terrestrial fauna expected to experience an overall benefit as a result of the improvements to floodplain condition enabled by the projects, and residual impacts are expected to be localised and temporary. Hollow-dependent fauna, the committee identified as a key issue, the short-term impacts on hollow-dependent fauna, and the floodplains you saw that there's a very large number of large trees and hollow-bearing trees. Ms. Jelly explained in her evidence that the hollows are created and lost in natural cycles, including as trees die and fall over time, and there'll be some impact on them. Consistent with Mr. Holmes' evidence, it's likely to result in a localised impact and no measurable impacts on population levels. You heard the exchange about the hollow replacement plan. Our position is that that sort of requirement's not appropriate, having regard to the matters that Mr. Holmes set out in his evidence that we'll pick up a bit later on, but really to the effect that it can do more harm than good. Aquatic ecology, you heard from Dr. Lefevre on day 5, and we recount what he said and what the conclusions are, working through those issues A through to F, and I don't propose to go through those. At 87, we provided information to you in respect of the use of the native fish exit strategy at Central, and the Central Committee concluded that on the basis that the EMF include requirements for monitoring and reporting of native fish strandings resulting from managed inundation and EDS requirements to address strandings, the committee found that the EMF should include provisions to require monitoring and reporting on fish strandings to support adaptive management. Fish stranding effects of the project can be acceptably managed through the committee recommendation EMF. And as noted above, Dr. Treadwell and Lefevre each identified that the return of low DO water will not result in any adverse effects, having modelled the increase in DO over time, rapid dilution. And the EDS is combined will ensure that no residual risk in that respect. Then turn to potential impacts on listed nationally and internationally important wetlands. The Minister required assessment of the potential for impacts on listed nationally and internationally important wetlands. Dr. Treadwell explained in the evidence that the potential effects of the projects on the ecological character of the Gunbow Ramsar site were assessed against the site's identified critical components, processes and services, the limits of acceptable change for those CPS, and the EPB SIAC significant impact criteria for Ramsar wetlands. Impacts to the CPS were assessed as generally minor, no exceedance of the LRCs were identified, and once the benefits of the operational phase are weighed against the construction impacts, overall residual impacts are not considered to be significant. The potential for the projects to give rise to impacts to other Ramsar sites was also assessed. Consideration given to potential impacts to the New South Wales, Central Murray Forests, State Forest Ramsar site across the river, and downstream Tahata Kalkine Lakes Ramsar site. And the environment report concludes it's unlikely that any significant residual adverse impacts would occur on any of those Ramsar sites. Then turn to B2, avoidance and mitigation measures, been addressed in the environment report in our part A and the relevant witnesses. But in this section, we address matters relevant to your task, which have arisen in the hearing. The need for offsets, we trust at this stage that you understand the position we put on that in terms of, we'll wait with interest to see what DECA says about it, but we trust that we've set out a logical basis upon which there's just no need for it to be included here. The hollow replacement plan, touched upon that a bit earlier on. Mr. Holmes' evidence that you've heard, his evidence wasn't challenged. We point to what the Central Committee said in respect of the hollow replacement plan, and key difference there, of course, was that they were making particular reference to I'll just read it, I'm sorry. DECA submitted that a hollow replacement plan should be considered to mitigate immediate and short-term impacts to hollow-dependent species from the significant loss of hollow-bearing tree losses. Mr Holmes gave evidence that while removal of hollow-bearing trees would likely displace individuals of common and threatened species and may even cause individual deaths, it was not considered likely to cause measurable impacts on populations of those species. Although not opposed to a hollow replacement plan, Mr Holmes submitted it was not warranted or a worthy mitigation due to the surrounding context. Specifically, there is no shortage of hollows. Further, the hollow replacement as part of the TLM was unsuccessful, where poorly insulated nest boxes possibly cause regent parrot nestlings to overheat and perish. If a hollow replacement plan were to be mandated, careful consideration of an appropriate compensation, noting one for one replacement, is almost certainly not achievable, particularly for the full range of hollow-dependent fauna, and suitable design, avoiding poorly insulated nest boxes would be required. The committee accepts Mr Holmes' evidence that any hollow replacement plan would need to be carefully considered to ensure it would be beneficial and did not cause negative impacts such as providing unappealing or unsuitable nesting boxes. While the committee understands this has been overcome in other projects by attaching natural or carved hollows to standing trees or stags in the landscape, it agrees a hollow replacement plan is not warranted in the context of the trees to be removed. The remaining landscape provides ample tree hollows, and the committee finds a hollow replacement plan is not warranted. And the Central Committee recommended a limited program for hollow replacement for priority fauna species. And so here we caution against a course of recommending a hollow replacement plan because the Minister did so for the ES Central and NIA VMFRP, and because DECA considers that here in the East identifies a comparable risk profile to those projects. Now, it's true that all VMFRP projects involve the risks identified in submission 13 in terms of impacts, potential short-term loss of nesting, roosting or shelter habitat and reliance on operational benefits to regenerate hollow resources over time. But those risks and their potential to give rise to impacts manifest very differently across different environments, and the mere existence of the same risks does not justify the same measures. And by way of potted example and leaving aside other differences between floodplains, which may be observed very substantially as the river flows from Gunbower at the eastern extent of the VMFRP projects to Hutter Lakes North at the western extent near Mildura, the ES Central and ER Central projects were assessed for the potential risk to EPB SIAC listed species, including the regent parrot, where surveys indicated nesting activity in hollows at a proposed regulated construction site. And so that was the species I was looking to on the previous page to say, well, that was really the key difference. So there was a heightened level of caution. They had a particular species that was EPBC listed with a nesting activity at a proposed regulated construction site, and you don't have those circumstances here. And you heard from Mr Holmes, he gave an example, I think it was a particular species of possum, saying how artificial hollows can lead to environmental harm. And my understanding of how we put the evidence was that you create these hollows of different sizes, you might get something like a possum that will go in and displace the birds. And so really just ends up an environmental harm from something that if you just leave the environment to itself, it would work fine. But the rider, of course, is you need to be in an area where we've got lots of hollows. If you didn't have that, you can see why a hollow replacement plan might make more sense. But at its heart, there's two reasons we submit you shouldn't recommend in favour of a hollow replacement plan. One is it's just not necessary because the forest provides so many other hollows. But on top of that, it's just an unnecessary expense to a project that's already going to be an expensive project in circumstances where you have unchallenged expert evidence that these sorts of things can do more harm than good. 111, it's really kind of an invitation. We expect that there's the person from DECA that might be making the submission might be listening to this. It's really an invitation to DECA to recognise the differences in the circumstances here and not press for that. But depending on what DECA says, we might respond further. So then turn to project documentation and the previous packages. In most respects, this project's consistent with the previous packages. There's some site-specific differences. We've set out in our day one incorporated document, we propose to remove conditions that were included that were relevant to set the NIA, VMFRP projects and ES Central on the basis that the further assessment identified in ES Central and ER Central committees necessary to establish the overall improvement to biodiversity has now been carried out and hadn't been in those projects, and the overall improvement to biodiversity has been demonstrated. And so the requirements for the ERS EMF, including in respect to project documentation, responsibilities, EDS and monitoring requirements, are comparable to those previous packages, and they differ from the previous packages in the following ways. So for ES Central and ER Central, recommended changes to EDS E3 to require the pest, plant and animal monitoring and management plan to address both terrestrial and aquatic pests, including carp, given the distinct responsibilities for land and water management and responsibility of DECA Park Victoria for the pest, plant and animal monitoring and management plan in their function as land manager. It is intended that this plan be relevant to terrestrial pests. In the ER East EMF, carp are addressed in EDS SW2 as relevant to the operation of projects in accordance with the operating plans, and in relevant monitoring requirements, including MAE1 being comparable to AE3 as recommended in the Central Committee, and accordingly aquatic pests are not referred to in proposed EDS E3. And specific reference to measures to assist private landowners with increased risk of pest presence and activity due to managed environmental watering, where the ES Central Hatter Lakes North project included inundation of private conservation land. No such inundations proposed here. This aspect of the recommended EDS is not reflected in the proposed EDS E3. The Minister recommended a new EDS E8 to require the preparation of a hollow replacement plan, as we've dealt with that. A number of the ES Central project-specific EDS monitoring requirements and recommended changes to them are not included here. And the ES Central Committee recommended project-specific changes to E1, E2 to 8, and you can see just some of the things in brackets that there for species that were over there that they're not relevant here. And then across on page 33B, also the Minister recommended a new EDS E9 requiring targeted surveys for specific species that are not relevant here. Similarly, 9 VMFRP, there's some other project-specific monitoring requirements not replicated, and we footnoted those there in 71. We've been through the other differences up above. And then in conclusion, we invite you to conclude that in terms of the benefits and effects, the projects are expected to result in overall improvement to the biodiversity of relevant floodplain ecosystems, including listed threatened species and communities. The proposed alternative arrangement to compensate for the removal, destruction or lopping of native vegetation and associated impacts is acceptable, and no biodiversity offsets are necessary, and no further feasible modifications to the project have been identified at this time. The proposed EDS appropriately provide for avoidance and minimisation of impacts through processes of design, construction and operation. So then the next topic is Aboriginal cultural heritage, which was identified as a key issue, impacts on known, unknown and intangible Aboriginal cultural heritage values. At C1, dealing with those values, the project objective we've cited there, the cultural significance of the floodplains and the benefits of the projects in cultural terms are recognised as a central consideration in the environment report. Traditional owner aspirations for restoration of floodplain ecosystems are explained in the environment report. As we set out in our Part A and opening submissions, the traditional owners and interested parties have played a meaningful role in the design and development of the projects through long-term and close consultation and engagement. As you saw in the CMA presentation on day one, the committee received further information and illustration of the matters addressed in our Part A submission in respect of the role of traditional owners in the development of its seasonal watering proposals, with self-determined engagement formats supported by year-round engagement and monitoring. The CMA walking alongside traditional owners, building an understanding of values and aspirations and strengthening cultural and ecological outcomes, and work done by the CMA in collaboration with traditional owners and other stakeholders in respect of specific sites and projects. The CMA's presentation and participation of traditional owners in the site inspections demonstrate the importance of the projects to the realisation of values and aspirations for the floodplains through arresting the trajectory of ecological decline and enabling benefits to the biodiversity values inherent in the country. Notwithstanding existing processes, the EMF enshrines consultation with traditional owners in relation to a wide range of matters, including in relation to all those matters listed A through H, as well as the requirement that the project control group, the operation, include an independent advisor in relation to traditional owner engagement and project management. Further, the CMPs, I'm at the top of page 36, the CMPs for the projects as relevantly approved and in preparation include requirements for consultation with traditional owners during construction. Aboriginal knowledge, values and aspirations are to be integrated into the planning, delivery and evaluation of the projects in accordance with EDSA CH2, and H3 requires consultation with relevant registered Aboriginal parties, traditional owners and interested parties as applicable in determining whether any protective or remedial measures are required during operation, and if so, how they are appropriately implemented. For central CMA specific processes and relationships and the values and aspirations of traditional owners and interested parties in respect to the project areas are of course distinct from those of the Mallee CMA and the people and groups relevant to the previously assessed VMFRP projects. However, the approach to an extent of the involvement of traditional owners and interested parties in processes to date and provision for genuine involvement of traditional owners in future processes are entirely consistent with those applied across the entire VMFRP. In the context of past packages, they have to satisfy the committee that traditional owners and interested parties have been involved in development of VMFRP projects and preparation of relevant assessment packages and CHMPs. Traditional owners and interested parties will have a continuing role in the operation of the VMFRP.
Mr. O'Farrell, can I just close another question out on that engagement process? I know prior to the start of the hearing, I think we asked the proponent to write to traditional owners and give them an opportunity to request to be heard. At the start of the hearing, you indicated there'd been no requests come through, but I'm just checking there hasn't been any change in that situation since then. I know we're towards the end of the hearing, but just checking before we... Obviously, we heard from, I know some people help with the presentations and we met them on site, but...
Yeah, Mr. Bartley just whispered to me that he would check with Mr. Shanahan, but he's listening and I can see a message in front of me that there's been no change. So we can confirm that there has been no.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
We then have a section on the evidence, and we rely on the evidence of the witnesses in respect to the expected benefits of the projects, the assessment of predicted effects on biodiversity, values and impact and habitat, and meaningful and significant to the realisation of cultural heritage values and aspirations of the floodplains. So in effect what we're saying there is that although that there's various disciplines that have led to to those conclusions that are giving opinions in their particular disciplines, the collective input of that is that across the floodplains, in terms of the cultural heritage values and aspirations for the floodplains, their conclusions are consistent with those outcomes. And so we called Ms. Ottaway to assist you in relation to assessments of cultural heritage values as relevant to construction and operation of the projects, including in respect of the preparation of the relevant CHMPs and the inundation areas cultural heritage assessment. We do so acknowledging that it is traditional owners and interested parties that speak for their values and aspirations. And it's on this basis that such focus is placed on ensuring the projects involve continuing engagement with traditional owners and interested parties into the future. 131, the environment report presents existing data and knowledge that traditional owners and interested parties have chosen to share, and examines and assesses benefit to and potential effects on cultural values. And as Ms. Ottaway explained, the work supporting the environment report has been carried out in accordance with relevant standards and guidelines, and that enables investigation, avoidance and minimisation of impacts associated with construction, as will be regulated by separate process under the Aboriginal Heritage Act. It also provides for an understanding of how the realisation of values and aspirations for country require the better alignment of inundation with natural conditions and the ecological requirements of the floodplain. Ms. Ottaway explained this specialist assessment had been prepared in accordance with the Minister's requirements and the scope for the environment report under the EPBC, and assessing both potential for impacts associated with construction in regard to construction footprint and inundation of the MIE. The assessment being informed by detailed close engagement with traditional owners from 2020 through to 2026, in addition to for the construction footprint utilising results of the CHMP processes, including desktop assessment, field surveys and excavation programs for the MIE through the desktop assessment. How tangible and intangible values have been considered in the preparation of the Specialist Assessment F and in the preparation of the relevant CHMPs. The potential impacts have been subject to avoidance and minimisation processes through project design, and such requirements will continue in accordance with the CHMPs and the implementation of the EDS relevant to Aboriginal cultural heritage. And increasing inundation and rehabilitating floodplain ecology will have broadly beneficial effects for Aboriginal cultural heritage. The East adopts the same approach to the involvement of the traditional owners and interested parties in future processes as that adopted in the central packages, and consistent with the conclusions of that committee. It is appropriate with respect for the committee to conclude here that traditional owner and interested parties have been involved in the development of the project and preparation of the environment report and CHMPs. Traditional owner groups will have a continued role in the operation of the project. The known views of traditional owner groups have been considered in preparing this report, and where the views are not known, the groups were invited to make submission and participate in the hearing. As we said in the opening submission, we then addressed the evidence of Dr. Pardo. It seemed at first blush, as we said in our open submission, that most of what he's saying that we could establish from the written document was consistent with fundamentally our client's position. And it seemed that after his oral evidence that remained the case, as he expressed support for environmental water initiatives and the importance of consulting and engaging with traditional owners. And that's precisely what is proposed by the project. The next section really just records what occurred, but without going through it in detail, it was really that experts largely they're a creature of their instructions, and it was a regrettable situation that wasn't the fault of Dr. Pardo, that he just wasn't given any instructions effectively. as we spent a fair bit of time trying to get to the bottom of it. Did you get documents? What did you get? And he really just apparently got some phone calls saying, can you help out? And he struck us as a gentleman that was a helpful person, interested in the community, and just responded to a call for help. But in circumstances where, as a creature of instructions, wasn't given really any instructions that related to your terms of reference, he wasn't familiar with your terms of reference of the referral letter, and conceded that he just wasn't really in a position to assist you with understanding what your task is. It was one of those situations that in the end we'd submit that wasn't really anything that arose from Dr. Pardo's evidence that ought trouble the committee. And we come to that conclusion really at paragraph 139 that we'd submit that, again, largely through no fault of his own, but his evidence is of no assistance to you. Even if there was something in there that you thought, oh, that might cause the committee to scratch its head about something or be concerned about something, we'd submit that there was really nothing that arose. But even if there was, we then point to a few bits that we say were a bit regrettable from Dr. Pardo's material, just in terms of he still hasn't made the declaration that's required of him. He was quite evasive on many occasions. We've been through that there in the materials, but again, we don't think this is the sort of case where the committee needs to be too troubled by, or as sometimes occurs, write up a particular witness and say, well, there's nothing that's necessary in this case. We think it's one of those ones where because he wasn't given instructions in the end through his own concession, he wasn't able to assist you with the task that you've got. And so it's one where the committee, when it comes to the evidence, that if there's a choice to be made, it's very easy for the committee to make it. Ms. Oldaway's evidence related to your task, Dr. Pardo's didn't. And so really the choice is quite easy. At 146, we record that Ms. Oldaway's evidence regarding the comprehensive nature of the methodology by which Aboriginal cultural heritage values have been considered and assessed, and how they've informed the project design and how they'll be relevant to the project construction and operation was compelling. And we've now got Ms. Peace's written submission, which she won't be delivering orally. Having reviewed it, we might not address anything further in our closing. But at the moment, there's nothing that would arise from that written material that we think would call for anything further. Then in terms of C3, on this topic, project documentation, the previous packages, in most respects, this one's consistent with the previous packages. Addressed that in the previous submissions in the opening. And the EMF does not include a new EDS ACH4 that was recommended by the Minister in respect of the Central Nine Vinifera projects, which provided for further analysis of potential impacts and management of ancestral remains, because as required, based on the further hydraulic modelling analysis recommended by the committee. The hydraulic analysis has informed the environment report, and as a result, the EDS is not required. That EDS is not required for this project. Cumulative impacts, each of the witnesses considered and gave evidence in respect of the potential for cumulative impacts, recording their examination and assessment of the environment report, and conclusions that the projects are not expected to result in any significant cumulative effects. These conclusions are consistent with the findings of the central committees regarding the relationship of the VMFRP projects with the balance of the interconnected basin and the consideration of broader landscape and population scale ecological values. Relevant matters are addressed as relevant to subject areas that we've addressed above, and the conclusions of the environment report and of all relevant witnesses is that the projects do not give rise to a significant risk of cumulative impacts.
So Farrell, can I just ask a question there? Are we talking adverse cumulative impacts in that context? I guess you're talking about the overall benefits. Here's all those comments framed in an
Yes,
adverse way.
that would be
I
a
think that's
useful
what the witness was.
addition. That would be a useful addition. And if I wanted to turn it around in aid of a favourable recommendation, I'd say that submit that the witnesses also gave evidence that the opposite, that the cumulative impacts, positive ones,
That's how I understood what they were saying.
significant.
Thanks.
Then indeed we deal with the interdependency of effects and the scope of further avoidance and minimisation. The projects have been conceived in the context of an environment with interrelated, interdependent values, and in terms of biodiversity as well as cultural heritage and social and business values. Fundamentally, achievement of benefits to biodiversity both in the narrow species and community specific sense and respect of the improved functioning of broader ecosystems are expected to give rise to benefits to the range of values targeted for improvement. The environment report has been prepared on a multidisciplinary basis, and we've given you an example there in relation to terrestrial ecology, contains assessments of potential impacts and benefits to flora and fauna, with interdependency explored as relevant at every step. By way of simple example in terms of impacts on vegetation and how that relates to habitat, the detailed analysis and assessments presented in assessment C and D directly informs the specialist assessment A, aquatic ecology, and specialist assessment B, terrestrial ecology, and vice versa. So the environment report, it presents a synthesised, holistic assessment of findings from all subject areas and how they relate in general terms and as specific to particular matters such as matters of natural and environmental significance. Not being addressed. So that we then turn to part two. I'm not sure whether you wanted to take a break at this stage or John. I think if we had another 20 minutes or so, we might get to the end. But
Maybe we'll have a break. And maybe, obviously, we just had that question about the secretary's role. Maybe on the break we could just address that at the end. I had another question, which is a little bit, we just got someone online with their hand up. I'll just turn to, I can't really read the screen, so I apologise, but.
Yeah, hello, it's Juliet Lefevre here. I'm one of the submitters. I'll be appearing before you tomorrow.
Right.
But before we move on, there's just a couple of things which have caught my attention during the discussion this morning. Really appreciate the body of evidence presented by the experts. They've done a very thorough job in their assessments. But there's a couple of things which are bothering me about it.
Okay.
You mentioned...
So, Ms. Lefevre, so in terms of, this is not, because the proponent's making submissions rather than giving evidence, there's not an opportunity to ask questions except the committee can ask questions. So if you have questions or things that have, raised concerns today, that deal with that tomorrow when you make your submission. So you can sort of include a response to anything that's popped up today and you want to address us on.
Okay.
With submissions, we have to, it's only experts that can be cross-examined.
Yeah.
Or
okay. All right. I'll bring them to you tomorrow. Thanks for that.
All right. Thank you.
See you then.
No worries. Okay. I just had just a general question, which just about in terms of the committee's reporting requirements. And I know we've already flagged at the directions hearing and the start of the hearing will obviously be, this is one process at the end of some other reports that you've taken us to this morning. But our terms of reference do require us to consider and report on, I'm just reading this out of, it's clause 5 of our terms of reference, the potential environmental effects and benefits of each project and make an assessment of their significance and acceptability. Your submissions have obviously focused on things that have arisen from submissions and the specific referral letter, which that's not a criticism, but is the intention that we then rely on the context, because it doesn't say significant. It just says the potential effects and benefits of each project, and then their significance. Would you like us to rely on the environment report, right? As in, there's no intention to make additional submissions on, I'll call them the other matters, but this is sort of a bucket of things that have been assessed where there hasn't been particular submissions or referral letters dealing with them.
Did you say 5?
I think it's clause 5. Might be misquoting, but
I'll have to think about the response to that.
yes. Yep. All right. We'll have a just a 20-minute break now. If I have to calculate that. Come back at 11:45.
Yeah, and when we get to it, we thought the committee might be assisted when we get to part 3. Mr. Forrest is going to put the documents up on the screen and just do a walk through on a few things.
Would be helpful.
Yeah.
All right. No worries. And that will be the day 1 version. Okay, no problems. All right, we'll come back at 1:45, and we'll come back online then as well for everyone who's listening in. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, so that the answer to the committee's inquiry about that term of reference 5 is that in our openings, our part A, in our opening, and even in the part B, we're seeking to respond to those terms of reference 5B.
Yeah.
In terms of the part B, we're seeking to really deal with your direction 40 and the matters that we've set out in the first paragraph of the part B, the first 3 bits just what to describe. But I think more generally, the answer to your question is that each of the witnesses specifically adopted the specialist assessment. So you've got evidence that adopts now each part of the specialist assessment. In addition, we rely upon the entirety of the environment report, all of our submissions, any materials that we've given to you, any responses to the questions on notice in answer to that term 5.
Okay, thank you. Going to address the other question, maybe when we can't actually, the other question about the ongoing role of the secretary. We've just been having a look at some of the documents over the break, so maybe we'll just deal with that when we get to your run through. Yeah. All right, thank you.
So then on page 43 of the part B is where part 2 is found, the response to issues raised in submissions under the heading of agriculture and aquaculture. The conditions from the Minister set out that the scope of the report do not require assessment of impacts on agriculture and aquaculture, other than as relevant to the assessment of potential cumulative effects of the projects and other VMFRP projects and other existing or planned projects in the area, particularly in relation to downstream aquatic environments and beneficial water uses. We note that the benefits of the project, and particularly the Camerons Creek pipeline, in respect to the maintenance of conditions in Camerons Creek, all consistent with natural flow patterns and reducing overwatering to Bagot Swamp. And you heard from Mr. Colvin, he acknowledged that something needs to be done and it should not be done to the detriment of the environment. Mr. Colvin's written submissions during exhibition of the project proposed that the Camerons Creek pump station pipeline be replaced with an alternative. In his oral submission, he acknowledged that the proposed pipeline will be required in the future and will be viable for some irrigators now. He identified that currently his family and one other farmer can pump water as required from Camerons Creek, and that they wish and intend to do so for as long as possible. Our client acknowledges the significance of the matters raised by Mr. Colvin in respect of water security and associated costs and the importance of those matters being dealt with. Those matters are not within the scope of the environment report or the committee's task, and the committee's assessment respectfully should recognise the ecological benefits that will be realised by removing the diverters from Cameron Creek. Its reporting can be informed by confidence that the proposed pipeline is a feasible means of providing water security for the diverters and environment in the Dunbar National Park. And as Dr. Lefevre noted in his evidence, water levels in Cameron's Creek and therefore Roe Lagoon will rise and fall with the Murray River levels as they do in current circumstances. The next submission is in relation to Nalgara Resources Indigenous Corporation. Ms Harden submitted that when wetlands fill, cultural responsibilities are activated. When waters move, stories move, knowledge moves, species move, people move, everything is connected. LMW observes that her call on behalf of the Corporation for Environmental Restoration to occur with traditional owners, not around traditional owners, and the submission of the committee should recommend the explicit recommendation of Barapa rights and interests, protection of tangible and intangible heritage values, direct engagement with Barapa decision-making structures, traditional owner-led cultural heritage processes, fair and equitable economic participation, and long-term traditional owner involvement in governance, monitoring and compliance. LMW acknowledges that specific matters raised in respect of economic participation, particularly in respect of budget and procurement, are beyond the scope of the Environment Report and this committee's process. The balance of the matters are reflected in development of the project and the Environment Report to date, and appropriately provided for in the EMF, including through its recognition of the responsibilities and rights of traditional owners and interested parties in respect of country, requirements for consultation and participation in future processes, and EDS and monitoring requirements. So Mr Forrester will now address you on part 3.
Thanks, Member McMillan. I'll turn to first section A, issues raised about the draft PSA being the language of the relevant part of the terms of reference, by really coming straight to the question about the future involvement of the Secretary in the context of both the discussion of the question around need for offsets, but generally in terms of the structure and purpose of the proposed incorporated document and its application. I'll speak to the day 1 version of the incorporated document, document 48, first observing that we've proceeded in providing our submissions to this committee in respect of the ERS package in circumstances where the Standing Inquiry and Advisory Committee in respect of both EES Central and the ER Central projects has concluded that the use of the specific controls overlay and the incorporated document is an appropriate way to regulate and authorise the necessary aspects of the projects as relevant to the planning schemes. In speaking to this question of issues raised about the draft PSA, I've jumped straight to page 5 of the day 1 document where the provisions regarding environmental management commence with clause 4.5. To note first, as we move past the requirements for and in respect of the EMF, condition 4.5.7 in the day 1 version of this document, which relates to the construction environmental management plan. That is the first document or aspect of the Secretary's involvement that I draw to the attention of the committee in respect of the requirements of the INCDOC for the CEMP and the requirements for that document to be approved and endorsed by the Secretary, and for it to, amongst other things, document all avoidance and mitigation measures to be implemented for the projects during construction and responsibilities for implementation. Turning over the page to what's now clause 4.5.8 in respect of the operational environmental management plan, a comparable requirement in respect of the operation of the projects required before environmental watering starts, and providing for the approval and endorsement by the Secretary of that OEMP, which in similar terms to 4.5.7 needs to document avoidance and mitigation measures to be implemented for the projects during operation. But in addition, in respect of operation, is required to include objectives, targets and indicators to be used for monitoring and evaluation of biodiversity response in accordance with the later clause 4.7, as well as the process for preparation, approval and implementation of a monitoring, evaluation and reporting plan, or MER plan. So the Secretary has the approval responsibility in respect of those documents. As I keep moving down to clause 4.6, as relevant to native vegetation, the committee's heard, of course, LMW's position in respect of what I'll call the offset conditions, or those aspects of clause 4.6 which relate to either the demonstration of overall improvement to biodiversity or the securing of offsets. What remains in clause 4.6, and importantly in the current context, is at condition 4.6.2 a requirement for, before removal, destruction or lopping of any native vegetation, information to be provided for the Secretary's approval and endorsement in accordance with specific application requirements identified from the native vegetation guidelines for removal, destruction or lopping of native vegetation.
Which is ask about that one.
Yes.
Just reading that over the break. Not that easy to follow.
Yes.
I just wondered if there might be an opportunity to clarify the drafting so it was a bit clear about what it's actually asking for. I assume it's kind of the, once you've done the detailed design, it's the confirmation of what is proposed to be removed. That's not really jumping out of that wording, and I understand it's been framed with reference to the guidelines, but yeah, it just, if there was another, I know it's from another example, so I say this with respect to those other processes, just think maybe plain English has gone AWOL there.
Can I start by identifying the position of my client would be to support the plain English drafting and the use of those principles in drafting the INCDOC. As you observe, Member McGillen, this is the same as clauses from
we realise that.
Documents. I'm also conscious, though, that it is language which is very much in which DECA very much has an interest. And so I won't respond on the fly to specific drafting or in respect of specific drafting beyond stating that sort of position in principle, and perhaps we can hear from DECA further about that.
That's fine.
What I'd like to observe now, and perhaps put in a way which would relate to however this clause was drafted, is that the intention in terms of the requirement for information in accordance with application requirements 1, 5 and 9, as it's currently expressed, means that I'm going to jump across to the guidelines and draw the committee's attention to the application requirements at page 24, with which the committee will be familiar. But the application requirement 1 is included in the clause, and that's for a native vegetation removal report. The one of most interest or relevance in the context of the Secretary's role and its relevance to the project's impacts is application requirement 5, and that's the requirement for an avoid and minimise statement, such that through the proposed clause in the incorporated document, there is a requirement for an avoid and minimise statement to be prepared, which in the formal sense describes and identifies the efforts to avoid the removal of and minimise impacts on biodiversity and so on, to be submitted to the Secretary for approval prior to commencement of works after preparatory works. Now, I'll note in passing, application requirement 9 actually relates to evidence of offsets being provided. And so we're considering whether through our final day version of this document we should strike through and 9, but come back to the committee on that, because I say we should strike through, whether striking through and 9 would be consistent with the proposal to otherwise remove the balance of these conditions, such that the import of clause 4.6.2 is apparently focused on information about through the native vegetation removal report and the avoidance and minimise depositions. So that's a flag for us to further consider. Yeah. Mr. O'Farrell's just let me know. We know DECA has observers in the room today, so we be interested to see if tomorrow we could have an indication of the position or perhaps discussion of these matters further.
Extended invitation.
I will extend the invitation.
Okay, I've just put some notes in there for when we get to DECA tomorrow and we can ask that question.
Clearly there's the drafting process provided for at the end of the hearing too. Now, the final thing to note on the incorporated document is that clause 4.7 in the day one version. I flagged this. It relates to monitoring and evaluation of biodiversity improvement. So we've dealt with the native vegetation impacts and through the CEMP and OEMP, avoidance and minimisation of impacts, if you like. 4.7 remains in the day one doc and deals with improvement. And it provides specifically for reports of monitoring activities to evaluate the extent of improvement and for those to be submitted to the Secretary 5 years after the first watering event and thereafter every 10 years, unless otherwise agreed by the Secretary. As well as dealing with improvement that has to pick up, as the committee will note, any unintentional impacts on biodiversity values, and it has to detail adaptive management proposed to be undertaken. So that's another aspect of involvement of the Secretary in this role as regulator, if you like. I then moved to the EMF.
Just to ask another question on the incorporated document, might be more of a drafting matter. And we will, we're going to have, obviously, tomorrow morning, we've got a little bit of time. The committee might have any mop-up questions then, so we'll try and present them all by tomorrow morning so you have time to deal with it in closing. But the new other conditions 4.9, maybe scroll over the page, just if you could just clarify the last part there. So I understand this is the process around amending documents or, the process for that. The last line says the relevant authority may seek the views of any relevant council or other authority. It's just potentially a little bit unclear about who's doing what there. And again, acknowledging this might be all, taken from other examples, but maybe you could have a look at that as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
The next matter is to turn to the environmental management framework itself. I'd like to do two things. The first is identify aspects of the environmental management framework which really relate to those matters that I've been to in the incorporated document. And the second is to identify other relevant ways or the detail perhaps of the Secretary's involvement, but also as relevant to the committee's task, requirements in respect of both compliance with and monitoring and auditing of compliance and achievement of project objectives. So continuing the theme of the Secretary's position to guide how we go about this, I'm first going to turn to questions about the construction environmental management plan. The committee will have observed EDS EMF2 requires the preparation and implementation of that document, and page 16.47, table 16.9 sets out roles and responsibilities during construction and identifies here in a way which ties back to the incorporated document the Secretary's role in approving the CEMP and all major revisions to the CEMP. Now, there are also requirements for, in the context of minor revisions to the any document, for the Secretary to be notified or consulted. The requirements for the CEMP are set out at section 16.9.3.1 and as we've identified in the Part A submission, the CEMP is required to contain all requirements, procedures and actions in respects of the compliance with the EMF. And that includes all of the EDSs, as well as all of the relevant monitoring auditing requirements in the context of construction. And in addition to the detail that's set out in that section, it's worth noting the requirement that EDS E2A creates, which requires that as part of the CEMP, there be a native flora and fauna management subplan, such that the native flora and fauna management subplan itself becomes an aspect of the matters that the Secretary is approving. So in the construction sense, we've got the Secretary responsible for the approval of the CEMP itself, for the approval of the native vegetation removal information, including the avoidance and minimisation statement, and the native flora and fauna management subplan. So we get through avoidance and minimisation into, well, how is construction going to be regulated to ensure compliance with relevant requirements, both in respect of native veg and in respect of fauna. The other aspect of the incorporated document I took you to in respect of monitoring as relevant to operations is also reflected in the EMF in terms of construction performance management. Question of monitoring in terms of CEMP and compliance during construction is linked both to requirements for the contractors to be reporting to the project in respect of their operations, but also to the independent environmental auditor's role. A monitoring program is required to be contained within the CEMP. That's set out in section 16.9.41. There are requirements for inspection and, as I've said, requirements for reports on a monthly basis to be provided to the independent environmental auditor and Murray Water. Those reports then feed into, pardon me, at the end of 16.9.4.3, there are provisions for the reporting to be distributed to relevant stakeholders, including the Minister. The reporting then feeds into the work of the Independent Environmental Auditor, or IEA. There are requirements for audits prior to commencement of works, 6 monthly during construction, and then at the end of construction. And the committee will observe on its review of the monitoring requirements, which I won't take you to now. There are monitoring requirements associated with many of the EDSs, which means that the auditor will have responsibilities, for example, in respect of the question of removal of native vegetation, monitoring requirements commencing with AI or auditing and inspection requirements, and the environmental auditor will have a role considering the reporting on how construction has been undertaken in accordance with EDS E1 in terms of avoidance and minimisation and so on. So all of these requirements feed back into the auditor's work, and the auditor's work feeds back toward both the Minister and the Secretary through their positions. Then in terms of operations, again, I'm framing this in terms of the Secretary's role, but noting the aspects of the EMF which relate to these matters go beyond just that question.
I think it's kind of a more, perhaps that was the one we picked out, but
that's right.
Just a general question about how that's going to work. Yeah.
Now, the OEMP, the Operation Environmental Management Plan, is reflected in similar terms in the EMF in the sense that it is required by EDS EMF 3. The operation of the projects in accordance with it is required by that EDS, and the requirement is for that document to be prepared by the CMA, given its responsibility for operations, and to be approved by the Secretary. Operations, as we've sought to stress in our written submissions, are governed by the EMF, including in respect of EDSs and monitoring and auditing and inspection requirements in similar terms to those I've been to for the construction phase. But it's important to also note, of course, the extent to which the existing environmental watering framework comes into play and the requirements of it. So we've got, again, requirements for the plan and requirements per the ICDOC for its approval and so on. But then, in addition to the OEMP, we've got the balance of matters relevant to the environmental watering framework in Victoria, which brings the department into a slightly different role to that approval function or regulatory function I've been to. And we've referred in our submissions to the EES Central Part A submission in terms of that framework and relevant roles and responsibilities for it. I'm just sharing a page from that Part A submission for the purposes of just illustrating this point. We've spoken, I'm going to zoom in to give us a chance of reading. We've spoken about the relevant documents, regional waterway strategies informing environmental water management plans, EWMPs or EWOPs, from which you heard from the about which you heard from the CMA, and then the CMA prepares its seasonal watering proposals on the basis of the EWOPs and expert advice and community engagement. The seasonal watering proposals then go up to the Victorian Environmental Water Holder to inform the seasonal watering plan, and the communication of decisions is through the watering statements and watering authorisations. So first, in terms of the blue boxes, which represent the CMA's responsibilities, the CMA, acting in accordance with its statutory functions and obligations in respect of catchment management and in respect of environmental watering, is required to carry out certain tasks on the basis of the information that's been prepared, including through monitoring, evaluation and reporting, and is required to implement adaptive management in those contexts. And that then is, if you like, subject to the oversight and ultimate decision making provided through the Victorian Environmental Water Holder. In the context of the Murray-Darling Basin, of course, there's another level, which also involves the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder and the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, providing an additional level of both input in terms of data, in terms of the tasks of monitoring, evaluation and reporting, but also in terms of ensuring adherence to regulatory requirements and ensuring achievement of environmental objectives of environmental watering. Now, I go to these for two reasons. First, as the EMF recognises, there remains, if you like, a role for the Secretary in the sense that DECA, the Water and Catchments Group, oversees the environmental watering framework in Victoria, but also in the context of consideration in the Minister's assessment of previous packages of the use of an independent environmental auditor for operation. It's noted the DECA also has involvement, of course, in the context of land management for Guttram and Benwell forests and in terms of fire management as represented by Forest Fire Management Victoria, as set out in the EMF table 16.5. The final thing to draw your attention to at page 16.50 of the EMF is the description of the role of the independent environmental auditor as proposed by VMFRP. That's a single place at which the various roles discussed through the EMF are set out. We've otherwise taken the committee to the aspects of the environmental management framework relevant to the avoidance, minimisation and management of impacts and relevant to the achievement of benefits at paragraph 183 and following of the written submission. And the written submission sets out how those requirements lead to confidence that there can be appropriate goals and appropriate operation of the projects consistent with the expectations of the ER and the expert witnesses in respect to the appropriate management of impacts and the appropriate achievement of benefits. To jump then back to paragraph 175 of the submission of page 45, we've noted as an issue raised about the draft PSA the question of the need for offsets, which we've addressed. Paragraph 176 and following deal with requirements in respect of bushfire in circumstances where DECA's submission seeks the inclusion in the incorporated document of a requirement or a condition requiring a fire access road plan. We note that there's a comparable requirement in the approved and gazetted incorporated documents for the EES Central and the NIA and VMFRP projects, but not one proposed in the draft incorporated document for ER East. That is, in simple terms, on the basis that the risk in the context of the ER East projects does not warrant such a requirement. We note that the specialist assessment in respect of bushfire, which is specialist assessment I, identifies that for the purposes of the relevant fire authorities, it's been identified that the relevant tracks are appropriate for bushfire response and suppression. That is to say, the bushfire specialist assessment does not identify any need to upgrade any tracks or roads for the purpose of bushfire response and suppression. And the question really comes down to, is there a requirement in the incorporated document, or is such a requirement justified in circumstances where the requirement would provide for, as articulated by DECA in its submission, consistent with the language of the approved incorporated documents, upgrades to tracks or upgrades to tracks to be carried out consistent with Victoria standards for fire access tracks.
I'm not sure whether I heard you correctly. So you said that DECA had asked for the fire access road plan as sort of a required plan to be prepared.
Yes.
And then you also said that the technical assessment said that the tracks or whatever they are up to the standard of the relevant fire authority. Is DECA the relevant fire authority? I'm just trying to understand. They don't seem to match. If I've understood that correctly.
No, you have understood it correctly.
Okay.
And yes, the Forest Fire Management Victoria is the relevant fire authority.
Yeah.
That's right. It's part of DECA.
Yeah.
It's the relevant fire authority for part of the projects. So the
Just about the parts of the different functions within DECA, or are you saying that the tracks themselves already meet the standard, so there's no requirement to supply an additional plan?
It's the latter. So let me show you what
okay.
DECA
Thank you.
has to say. So from the DECA submission, there is quite simply, I'm on page 29, I'll just jump up to where that's discussed. There's a recommendation included at section 3.8 of the DECA submission for a condition requiring the preparation of a fire access road plan. And again, that's consistent with the incorporated documents for other projects, which I think is in the last paragraph in sections 3.7 is the basis on which that's put. DECA effectively says it's essential that any road or track upgrades associated with the project maintain or improve full functionality for appliances and so on. And the question therefore is, well, are we talking about road or track upgrades either from a position which is unsatisfactory, or is there a specific requirement for road or track upgrades to achieve or result in some particular level of accessibility? And the way on which the specialist assessment proceeds is that it considers questions of access, including having regard to the strategic fire access network and the operational access network. It contains assessment of bushfire hazard, of course, including having regard to accessibility. I'm sharing table 5-10, which is at PDF page 116, page 88, and which is relevant to Gunbower. And it identifies in the paragraph that I've highlighted on the screen, access tracks within public reserves are maintained by DECA and Parks Victoria to standards consistent with relevant departmental publication and are considered adequate for bushfire response and suppression. That's attributed to a personal communication with the Forest Fires Management Victoria Senior Forest Fire Management Officer. Access tracks are otherwise considered in the specialist assessment, such that it's in my submission not just that personal communication but the assessment which concludes there's no need for upgrades. And the specialist assessment identifies the current maintenance of access tracks in the context of vegetation adjacent to them being mechanically treated, lopped, pruned, like in accordance with the JFMP, the Joint Fire Management Plan, and this will continue following project implementation. So the proposition is, the same or similar assessment appears at table 8-4 at PDF page 157 to 158 in respect of Guttram and Benwell. So the proposition is, number one, the bushfire specialist assessment identifies that the project would not alter the locational performance of the road network. Number two, it identifies that the tracks are maintained to standards, to appropriate standards now, such that any maintenance or upgrades can be expected to be similarly compliant with standards. And in circumstances where there is no identified requirement for any change to achieve bushfire related accessibility requirements, there's no warrant for a condition in the incorporated document to require that. Put it another way, if the project isn't giving rise to a need to address this matter, and it's just a matter of management in general fire management terms, that's a matter for the fire manager and not for the fire authority and not for this project. So that's the basis on which such a requirement wasn't included in the exhibited and isn't included in day one, but we'll hear what DECA has to say. The incorporated documents for previous projects also include a specific condition requiring a bushfire emergency response plan, really as a matter of structure and approach. That's been included in the ER East EMF in an EDS BF1 rather than in the incorporated document. In our submission, that's more appropriately dealt with in the EMF than as a planning proposition, given the nature of the risk it relates to and the fact that they wouldn't otherwise be regulated in that way.
I just jump in before we leave that page. Just going back to the offset condition, Mr. Forrest, sorry, if you could share 4.6.2, we've realised that that was intended to have been deleted in a day one, the 4.6.2.
In the incorporated document.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Bring that up, Mr. Forrester.
Yep.
That was the one with the application requirements.
Yeah. So if you scroll down to the bottom of that stanza up to 6.3.6, if you can, down in there, the third last line, assessment of overall improvement by investigation. L&D considers that condition 6.3.3, 6.3.4, etc., could unnecessary and could be removed from the final version. So that's those ones, but on above it, you can see there's a note that's also crossed out. Clauses 6.3.2, 3.4, 3.5 not applicable if offset's not required. So what we've got there is 4.6.2. In hindsight, we should have crossed that out on the basis that there's not going to be offsets required. 4.6.1 puts the ceiling on the vegetation removal. And so again, I'm conscious that DECA representatives are listening, but that was an oversight that was intended to have been deleted. 6.2, and then the only other thing while we've got this document open was the committee's inquiry in relation to 4.9.2 on the next page. We think that is better served with a full stop after the word document and then delete the relevant authority may seek the views of any relevant council or other authority, because there's no statutory process that speaks to that. And if whoever the relevant authority is wants to seek the views of someone else, there's nothing to stop that from occurring. But we think that it's better drafted with a full stop after the word document. So that our final day documents.
I hope the DECA people are listening online to this. Just a further question about your comment on 4.6.2. I understand what you're saying if there's no offset requirement, so quantifying the extent of veg removal, sort of understand, the main purpose of that is then to calculate what the offset is. Is the same true for the avoid and minimise statement? I guess given your submissions that there'll be a detailed designing process that continues to try and minimise, I'm just wondering if it all gets deleted or whether there's still a role for that avoid, minimise and offset statement. Not offset, avoid and minimise part of that statement.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's something we can hear from DECA, I think, and maybe deal with this in closing, but just how that would function.
We think it can still work okay without the 4.6.2 because Mr. Forrester can point you to the other part of the EMF.
Oh, okay.
I was just going to ask,
might be,
there was
somewhere
what we
else.
call EDS.
EDS.
Yes.
That deals with this. Yeah.
Because of EDS E1,
Yeah.
which effectively requires avoidance and minimisation,
We don't need to.
because compliance with that and reporting in respect of compliance with that would be a matter that goes to the Secretary
Same.
and goes to the Independent Environmental Auditor. It's fundamentally the same obligation.
Okay.
So I apologise, I hadn't picked up that note that Mr. O'Farrell drew your attention to in terms of the clause being not applicable. If offsets are not required, I understand that note itself is present in the approved incorporated documents for EES Central and NIRA and VMFRP. So offsets aren't required, compliance with what is now 4.6.2 wouldn't be required in respect of those projects. So the deletion of that would be consistent with that position. The next part of the written submission goes to consultation. That's page 46, paragraph 181 to 182. The ER, both in attachment A and elsewhere, and in the part A submission, provide information in respect of the consultation and engagement which has been carried out, and for example, how that's been brought into the project design and refinement processes as detailed in attachment 7 to the ER. On that basis, we submit consultation has been adequate and further processes of consultation provided for in the EMF are appropriate. In that context, we note the EMF requirements for consultation, for example, with Ganawara Shire Council in respect to relevant matters, with DECA, with other stakeholders throughout. I've referred the committee to what then follows at part C, project documentation, in terms of the requirements of the EMF in respect of operation, monitoring, evaluation and reporting, evaluation, how data would become, data produced as part of these projects would become part of the broader public domain, if you like. Everything is required to be reported transparently and in a way which feeds into the broader environmental watering programs as that relates to operations. The EMF enshrines and identifies adaptive management and as we've set out, relate to or contains requirements for consultation with stakeholders, including traditional owners throughout. The final note in terms of the changes as between the EMF and previous packages, noting those which have now been approved for Hatter Lakes North, Balsar, Yungera and Nyah and Vinifera. Those EMFs include the requirement for an independent environmental auditor to be appointed in respect of operation, and that's on the basis of recommendations of the Minister in circumstances where the committees considering those projects identified and were satisfied with the requirement as relevant to construction, but didn't consider whether one should be appointed for operation. In our submission, the use of an IEA for construction is a significant and appropriate requirement. It is a requirement which is responsive to the most significant potential impacts of the projects or the phase of the projects which involve the highest potential for impact. Where it's appropriate to establish, if you like, this specific regime of monitoring or confirming, auditing compliance with construction management. In contrast, in terms of operation, the nature of the environmental watering framework is such that there is a high degree of confidence that the planning and delivery of environmental water will be subject to robust processes in respect of planning and delivery, and will be subject to the oversight of multiple governmental agencies, each with statutory functions and responsibilities relevant to ensuring that operations carried out consistent with relevant objectives for environmental watering, including achievement of benefits and including in respect of the adaptive management of operations to achieve that. On that basis, the use of an independent environmental auditor is unnecessary, effectively replicates existing arrangements and consistent with other submissions. We invite the committee to be conscious of questions of unnecessary duplication and cost in the absence of any indication that significant risks arise which would warrant such a requirement. And we therefore invite consistency with the previous findings of the Standing Inquiry and Advisory Committee in maintaining that the EMF should not require the appointment of an auditor for operation.
Right, so that then brings us to the conclusion, and we expect by this stage of the hearing, we expect that the committee would understand what a conclusion would say.
Yes.
So unless there's any others we can assist with, that's our part B.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for taking us through the documents as well. I think that's been helpful. Just check Elliot.
Probably a few things, but I guess we might bring them to the table tomorrow. It might arise. But one thing I did have on mind, what we talked about on our break, was in the event that might be a question for DECA, the Secretary is not inclined to provide that exemption. Would it then be that we would reinsert those provisions in the incorporated document that you've ruled out?
if that's what you recommended it in favour of, but if the secretary comes back with that position tomorrow, we just put that into your court.
Sure.
Because our submission to you would be that in all the circumstances, it would be efficient for the delivery of the project, so as to get the project to the environment quicker, to skip that step. So effectively have a plan control that provides permission to remove the vegetation, because we've been through the assessment process. You know what DCAS says, and even though the DECA officers might not be prepared to go the whole way tomorrow, we encourage them to do so. Even if they don't, we think that the Minister would be assisted by your recommendation just to go the next step.
Understood.
But the answer to you is yes, you just put it back in if at the end of the day that's what the Minister wanted to do. But we urge the committee to recommend in favour of the position we're putting.
Yeah, understood that. And thank you for the submissions that point out to lessons learnt, as I would read them, and just putting it to you if there's any others that you think would be appropriate in your closing submission that might be of benefit to us in our deliberations. That would be useful.
Go to Member Bates just to check if he had anything.
No, I have no questions.
Oh, just repeat that.
I have no questions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, all right. So the plan from here is that, as mentioned, the committee will just consolidate any remaining questions we have on your Part B submission and just give you enough time to deal with them in closing. We've received, I think over the last hour or so, we've received a few submissions for the presentations tomorrow, presentations for the submissions we're expecting tomorrow. And we've also received advice that Mr. Tyson Williams won't be appearing, so there might be a slight adjustment in the timetabling. But I think we'll just run as scheduled, and if we need to stand the matter down for a little bit of time, we'll do that as we sort of go along the way. And we also have a submitters who are attending a combination of online and in person. And we expect that Member Bates will also be online tomorrow as well. So, so we'll come back tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. and then we'll hear from, I think it's Audrey Dickens first up, who'll be online. Okay. I think we've covered everything. Okay, we'll close for today. Thank you.